Hello, Galaxy Studios here, aka Permacharge if you play Eris.io. Please leave your hate comments below. Coming at you with the countdown video. For my first YouTube video, I decided to talk about tournaments. I've seen a lot of tournaments in books, movies, television, and yes, even anime. I've seen a lot of them, and as you can probably tell from the title of this video, I'm going to be ranking my 10 favorites. This list was really hard to make. I had to dredge up long-forgotten information from the deepest pits of my mind. This is an absolutely stacked list where every single tournament on the list got an 8 out of 10 score or above, so let's just jump right into it. A couple things to note. First off, this is a fully subjective list, meaning this will be filled with those opinions you hear so much about. Feel free to leave a tournament you feel I missed in the comments section, and I'll let you know if I've seen it and just didn't like it as well as any of the 10 tournaments on this list. As well, timestamps for all 10 tournaments I'll be talking about will be in the description. No spoilers though. You'll have to find out what these tournaments are yourself. With those out of the way, let's get started. These are my 10 favorite tournaments in fiction. Enjoy. My pick for number 10 is the tournament developments from LEGO Ninjago Masters of Spinjitzu. And this is the point where a lot of people start laughing at me. You know who you are. Yes, you. The people who haven't seen this show. As for everybody who did see this show, I'm sure this is the moment where you realize exactly how stacked this list is. LEGO Ninjago holds up better than it has any right to, and the tournament developments is honestly my favorite season of the show. By far, the biggest positive I can give this tournament is how it's structured. It avoids so many pitfalls anime tournament arcs are known to fall into. There's never any doubt why the heroes are staying in this tournament despite it being set up by the villain. There's no pacing problems whatsoever, and not only is there no plot armor, some of the heroes have to fight each other. On top of that, I appreciate how as soon as the stakes and outside events become too big to be contained within the tournament narrative, the tournament just ends and we transition to a pretty standard third act. Everything about this tournament story is pulled off expertly. However, the action is where I have some problems. The action in this tournament is easily the weakest out of any tournament on this list. The only standout fight is Jay versus Cole, and even then, it's not that great. And that lack of standout action is why this tournament only sits at number 10. Still, it's a great season of television that I recommend to anyone under the age of 12. What is it with LEGO adaptations being so good? Okay, moving on. If the tournament developments was structured perfectly with substandard action, then Kangen vs. Purgatory is the exact opposite. The action is the best part of the tournament by far. There are so many standout fights, and not a bad one in the bunch, with my favorite probably being a bit of a sleeper pick, the Serpent versus the Author. I won't say anything more about that. But although the action is certainly great, I've always felt like this tournament is handicapped by its structure. The fact that it's a best of 13 tournament of 1v1 fights means we only get to see everybody fight once, which means it's extremely hard to build up the real threats on the enemy roster, which is most apparent with the designated final boss. Although, based on recent chapters, that final boss is turning out to be a better character than I ever expected. Overall, I still had a great time reading this tournament and I can't wait to see how it ends. This is one of the most underappreciated tournaments on this entire list and you should definitely check it out. Haikyuu is basically everything I could ever want in a sports show and more. I've rarely had more fun watching a show in my life. I adore every single character in the main cast and most of the characters in the supporting cast too. The action is stupendous and needs to be seen to be believed. And I appreciate how there's no villains in this show, just real people who want to win just as badly as the protagonists. Honestly, this isn't a review of any tournament as much as it is a review of the first 3 seasons of the show, since the tournament and the activities surrounding it take up the entirety of those 3 seasons. I've given my overall thoughts on the show, and I don't think I need to say anything more regarding why I love the series. However, I will acknowledge that this tournament does have pacing problems in a few areas. But I love it anyway. I mean, the Miyagi Inter-High qualifiers did make number 8 on this list. That should tell you everything you need to know about how much I love it. Please, watch Haikyuu. It's so great, you guys. You have no idea. Naruto. I'm working my way through the series right now, and so far, I understand why it's part of the big 3. And if I'm being honest, the arc that first made me realize that was the tuning exams. While I liked Wave Escort Mission and thought it was a great introduction to the story, the tuning exams blew that arc out of the water. As I was watching it for the first time, I realized why so many people loved it, and to this day, it's my second favorite arc of the series. but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have any problems with the arc. So let's get those issues out of the way. First, this arc suffers from pacing problems, especially during the playoffs, where it puts way too much focus on Naruto. I mean, why did Naruto vs. Kiba have to be that long? My other major issue with the arc is that the action's quality is extremely inconsistent. There's a lot of standout fights, which I'll get to, but there's also a lot of fights that are just there to fill space, which wouldn't bother me that much if every single one of them didn't drag on for ages. But that's all the major negatives. Let's talk about the good stuff. The first stage of the exams, the written test, is more tense than it has any right to be, and is a perfect introduction to exactly what this exam is going to be. The Force of Death sequence is even better, featuring great fights with both the Sound Ninja and the Collectors, as well as an unforgettable encounter with my current favorite villain in Naruto, Orochimaru. And then once the playoffs start, everything gets kicked up a notch. There are so many memorable fights in this section, including Sasuke vs. Yoroi, Sakura vs. Ino, both fights from my favorite character in the entire series, Shikamaru, Hinata vs. Neji, Naruto vs. Neji, Gar vs. Sasuke, and I can't hold this in any longer. Gar vs. Rock Lee is probably the best fight in any tournament on this list, and my second favorite fight out of everything I've seen from Naruto. It's incredible how this fight manages to do everything perfectly, from the animation to the choreography, to how absolutely perfectly it writes Rock Lee, my second favorite character in all of Naruto. That moment with the leg weights, come on! This fight is just absolutely perfect on so many levels, and the entire reason why this tournament even made the list in the first place. I don't know what else I can say about this tournament after talking about that fight. Well, I will say that the interruption was pulled off really well, although it's outdone by a similar interruption later on in this list. The second half of the arc is also great, but it doesn't count for the purposes of this list, but yeah. Overall, I love this arc, and now that I've seen it, I understand why it's one of the most iconic tournament arcs of all time. It's certainly my second favorite arc of Naruto so far. As for what my favorite arc is, take some time to think about why Shikamaru Nara is my favorite character in Naruto. Ruby is a series that holds a special place in my heart. It means a lot to me, and in my opinion, Volume 3 is the second best volume of the series, only being beaten by Volume 6. And although the Vital Festival is certainly the worst half of the volume, it's still really great. There is so much to talk about with this tournament, so let's get started. First, it's really fun. The low stakes means there's never a guarantee as to who will win, and we're free to enjoy the action as much as possible. And the action's great. I feel like Ruby vs. Auburn is a really underrated and effective fight that perfectly opens the volume and the tournament. However, the rest of the first round and the entirety of the second round really don't live up to that bar in my opinion. None of those 4 fights are bad, but they're not nearly as good as they could have been. And then the finals hit and things get turned up to 11. Yang vs. Mercury is the only martial arts fight in Ruby to date, and it takes full advantage of that. This fight's amazing choreography, creative combat tactics, and an ending that really took me off guard make this a fight to remember, and one of the best in Ruby. And to think that isn't even the best fight of the tournament. Pyrrha vs. Penny is absolutely phenomenal. It's tense, it's suspenseful, it's breathtaking, and it has stupendous choreography. And the way this fight ends broke me. And everything leads up to the single best tournament arc interruption I have ever seen in my life. I cannot overstate how perfectly the hijacking of the show's entire narrative is set up and followed through on. And despite the Ruby fandom's tendency to argue non-stop about literally everything, I think that we can all agree that the second half of Volume 3 is the absolute pinnacle of Ruby. But that isn't relevant to this discussion, so only considering the tournament itself and how it ended, it was great. I always have a ton of fun revisiting it, and it's an iconic chapter in a series that is still going strong to this day. Wait, did I say that out loud? Also, I'd like to take some time to shout out my friend's Ruby fanfiction that he's been working on ever since he saw the show for the first time. I've read the current version, and it's incredible. He's not only managed to retell the original story perfectly in this new format, but he's managed to make some really compelling stories for his original characters, one of which I designed myself. The link to the fanfiction will be in the description, and if you've seen the show, you should please check it out. Alright, it's time to talk about My Hero Academia. I went through the series recently, and it's great. I know there are some people out there who are calling it overrated, but I honestly had a really fun time watching it, and one of my favorite arcs of the entire series is the UA Sports Festival. This is the typical tournament arc formula perfected in nearly every way, avoiding the 2 problems tournament arcs are notorious for having: pacing problems and plot armor. I'll get back to plot armor later, but this arc is only 11 episodes long. The pacing is basically perfect throughout, and I never felt once like too much time was being spent on a fight. Now let's get to the action. The opening race was super hype, and I nearly cheered when Deku won the race quirkless. The cavalry battle was almost as good, involving a lot of great plays from a lot of characters, including Bakugo, who really starts to become more than the generic rival character in this arc. And as for the playoffs, there are 3 fights I want to talk about, though I should mention that although a lot of the fights don't matter to the overall story, they're short enough to not feel drawn out and like they're wasting time, while still being long enough to not feel like nothing important happened at all. Now, on to the good stuff. Deku vs. Shinso is very atypical from a technical standpoint, but it works wonders. I also love how it made the viewers, me included, realize that everything we were thinking about Hitoshi Shinso was what everybody in Shinso's life was thinking about him. It's neat stuff. Bakugo vs. Uraraka is the most technically impressive fight of the tournament, and beyond that, I love when the teacher scolds the audience for their gender biases and mistaking taking an opponent who dropped a meteor shower on you seriously for battering a helpless little girl around. And then there's Deku vs. Todoroki. This is easily my favorite fight of the tournament, and one of the 2 best fights of the season. It somehow manages to be both technically stupendous and emotionally resonant at the same time. It seems ludicrous at first that a fight that is literally 2 people hitting each other as hard as they can until one of them goes down can have an incredible technical narrative, but it works because of how well the power sets and limitations of both characters are established, and because of how the technical and emotional narratives are connected. I mean, this was a fight where Deku used One For All on his broken finger. And talk about avoiding plot armor, the main character loses in the quarterfinals. That's right. Deku pushed himself harder than he'd ever gone before, to in turn push Todoroki over his limits and help him accept his power as his own, and Deku lost because of it. This was honestly what pushed this arc over the edge to get a 9 out of 10 rating for me, the first one I've given in this list. Honestly, I can't recommend this arc and this show enough. The UA Sports Festival is an absolute masterpiece and one of the best arcs My Hero Academia has ever produced. Before I list my pick for number 4, I'd like to remind you all that there's a reason that some pieces of media are as influential as they are. It's because they work. People see them, love them, and try to replicate what made them special. With that said, my 4th favorite tournament in fiction is the 74th Hunger Games. What is there to say about this book that hasn't been said already? It's a masterpiece, and everyone knows it. However, I really want to shout out 2 things that elevate this tournament to that status. First, the slow pacing. This works perfectly for the brutal atmosphere that this story is going for, and made me really invested in all of the characters as the games progressed. And the second aspect, I felt every major character death in my soul. Thresh, whose death we don't see as he is slain by Kato only a few days after proving he was one of the best people in the arena. Foxface, who ate poison berries after succeeding in outlasting the games for 2 weeks. Kato, who despite being the most brutal of all of them, was helpless to stop himself from being ripped apart by mutations, and had his life ended as an act of mercy. Rue, who needs no introduction. I don't think I can say anything more about the most iconic tournament in fiction that hasn't been said already. It's absolutely incredible. Ooh boy, it's finally time to talk about Dragon Ball! This series basically pioneered the idea of the tournament arc in general, and has given us a lot of great tournaments since then, from the World Martial Arts tournaments, to the Tournament of Power, to everything in between. And my pick for the best Dragon Ball tournament arc is this fanfiction. I'm dead serious. Dragon Ball Multiverse is the best fan manga I have ever read in my life. With one exception, this is the most fun I have ever had reading a tournament arc. The premise, despite being pure wish fulfillment, is still pulled off perfectly and with no plot holes, which leaves us free to have fun in this simple, low-stakes Dragon Ball what-if crossover tournament. Gogeta Jr. and Ashura managed to capture Toriyama's art style perfectly, leading to some phenomenal artwork that enhances the action. And let's talk about that action. Similar to the sports festival, a lot of the fights are over quickly, but they never overstay their welcome, and so none of them were boring to read through at all. And that makes the standout fights even more enjoyable, so let's get to those now. From the first round, Gotenks vs. Gotenks was beautiful, and this fan manga uses Gotenks better than Dragon Ball canon ever does in general. I will not compromise on that front, don't even ask. Vegito vs. Broly was epic. I was not expecting the 2 strongest characters in the entire tournament to fight in the first round, and it was awesome. Moving on to round 2, the main standout fight here for me is a bit of a sleeper pick, Vegeta versus Raichi. It's a long, brutal, harrowing, drawn-out villain versus villain fight that is horrifyingly effective from beginning to end, facilitating the single best Super Saiyan 3 transformation I've ever seen in Dragon Ball, canon or otherwise. This fight needs to be seen to be believed. And in round 3, my pick for the best fight of the entire tournament, Sun Bra versus King Cold. This fight is stupendous on every level. From the personalities of two great characters playing off each other extremely well, to the handicaps that give this fight the uncertainty it needed, to how it fully utilizes the full potential of the Frieza race, to the flat-out insane paneling and choreography, this fight has it all. And the ending absolutely blew my mind. And of course, my best compliments are reserved for the interruption, the absolute best part of the entire fan manga. This is where a ton of characters peak, including both versions of Gohan, Cell, who is absolutely the MVP of this battle, and most notably, Sun Bra. This portion of the story is what solidified Sun Bra as my favorite new character in Dragon Ball Multiverse, as she is an absolutely terrifying force on this battlefield who manages to single-handedly take down everybody else combined, and the ending nearly brought me to tears. Dragon Ball Multiverse has been incredible so far, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. Salagir has set up some compelling mysteries with Buu, Xi, and especially Vegito that I can't wait to see realized. Up until recently, this was my second favorite tournament arc of all time. And then something I never saw coming happened. And if you've been paying attention to social media at all, you probably know what it is. I don't know if there's anything I can say for this one. Squid Game devastated my heart in a way few works of fiction have ever done. Like I said for Hunger Games, there's a reason why Squid Game has blown up as much as it has. It's a masterpiece. With one exception, every single one of the 6 death games is phenomenal, and even the exception isn't bad by any means. It's still good, and the remaining 5 broke me over and over again. Honestly, even in this countdown, I won't spoil anything about this show. If you've been avoiding this because of how oversaturated it's become on social media, please watch it. It's worth every bit of the attention it's gotten, and I'm glad that I watched this show before I could be turned away. I certainly wasn't expecting it to overtake Dragon Ball Multiverse as my second favorite tournament arc of all time. Then again, it stood absolutely no chance of touching my top pick. But before I get to that, here are some honorable mentions. Yeah, we're doing this. Moscow Invitational, Queen's Gambit. This show single-handedly reignited my passion for chess, and the finale is my favorite episode of the series. Although most of what makes that episode phenomenal is in the first half, the tournament in the second half is still great. Third Quarter Quell Games, Catching Fire. Catching Fire is honestly a perfect sequel, but it isn't quite as good as the original book, and that philosophy applies to the Quarter Quell as well. It's still great, but it loses a lot of what made the original a masterpiece. 23rd World Martial Arts Tournament, Dragon Ball. This is my favorite Dragon Ball canon tournament arc. It's a ton of fun, although I feel like it's carried a bit by the final battle. I will shout it out for also having the best quarterfinal round of the World Tournaments, though. And finally, Beyblade World Championship, Beyblade Metal Masters. I had to give a spot to the first tournament arc I ever saw. With that said, it's not that great. At all. And with that, we move on to my favorite tournament arc of all time. It's something I don't think many of the people watching this have ever heard about. It's one of the most underappreciated works of fiction I have ever seen. And if you've been paying attention to this list, or if you've even seen this tournament once, you know exactly what my top pick is. Where do I even begin with the Kangen Annihilation Tournament? This tournament is so phenomenal in every way, from the artwork to the choreography, to the narratives, to the characters, to the subversions, that placing it at number 1 was the easiest decision I had to make when I made this list. It has everything great about Dragon Ball Multiverse, but cranked up to 13 and without any of the drawbacks. Now my goal with this review is to encourage you to read the source material, because the adaptation really doesn't do this masterpiece justice. And I'm not just talking about the CGI animation, although that is a factor. First of all, the biggest problem with the adaptation is the cut content from the original series, including the Street Fighter crossover. Yep, that's a thing. And second, although the CGI isn't terrible, I mean, it's better than the Dragon Ball Super Superhero trailer, it was still a disappointment to go to pretty well animated CGI models from the literal best artwork I have ever seen in a manga. This art style needs to be seen to be believed. But like I said, I really want you to check out the source material, and because of that, and because I could talk about this tournament for literal days, I'll only be discussing my favorite fights that have been adapted into the anime. Since every single fight in the tournament is great, this wasn't an easy list to narrow down. From round 1, one fight I feel needs more attention is Sekibayashi Jun vs. Kyozan Takeru. It's an excellent battle of ideologies between one fighter who sticks true to the foundations of their sport and one who thinks he's bringing his style to its roots, but gets called out on using that philosophy as an excuse to mimic mixed martial arts. And that works wonders. It's probably my second favorite fight of the round. Kaneda Suikichi vs. Galang Wongsawat is the most underrated fight in the entire series in my opinion. It's a perfect showcase of what makes Kaneda one of my favorite characters in an absolutely stacked cast. His underdog story is pulled off perfectly, making for an incredible fight that sadly suffers more from the lackluster adaptation than almost any other fight. Okubo Naoya vs. Kano Agito, on the other hand, is the best adapted fight of the series. It's a perfect introduction to not only the Fifth Fang and Metsudo, but also the King of Combat. And I appreciate how a fight between 2 of the 10 strongest characters in the tournament ended up being simply a very high-level mixed martial arts match. There's several videos on YouTube of MMA fighters breaking down the techniques used during the adaptation of this fight. And besides the CGI models and all the missed opportunities with the soundtrack, this fight was adapted perfectly. It would be a perfect season ending if the adaptation didn't realize that one of the best parts of this tournament is that every fight is equally important. But let's move on. Both of the fights that have been adapted from the second round are 2 of the best fights of the entire series. Imai Cosmo vs. Okoye Seishu is an absolutely brutal and effective fight from beginning to end, with some absolutely incredible plays from both characters and moments that left me breathless throughout. The eventual victory felt like a genuine triumph. The anime doesn't do this fight the justice it deserves, especially with the character of Okoye Seishu. And then there's Tokida Oma vs. Kure Ryan. I won't waste any time. This is my favorite fight of the entire series, and I could gush about it for ages. Everything about it is done absolutely perfectly, from the flat-out insane technical narrative involving Oma pushing himself to his absolute limit time and time again, to the external stakes involving a family member of one of the main characters, to Oma's struggle on which of his master's teachings he wants to follow, to Yamashita Kazuo's best moment in the entire series following this fight's breathtaking conclusion. Even in my favorite round of the tournament, this fight is a major standout, and in my opinion, the absolute pinnacle of the series. Honestly, I could talk about everything that makes this tournament phenomenal for literal days, but I need to end it here. This tournament is simply transcendent, and I'll be making a larger video breaking down everything I adore about it. With one exception, every single fight in the entire tournament would be god tier in any other story. It's almost impossible to predict who's going to win any one of the fights, which left me on the edge of my seat throughout. And on top of all of these other strengths, the characters are amazing, it's absolutely hysterical, and just reminding you, has the best artwork I've ever seen in a manga. Please, if there's anything you should take away from this video, then it should be to read Kengan Ashura. If you've checked out the anime and returned away by the CGI, if you read the manga and returned away by the slow start, or even if you've seen and loved the anime, please read the entirety of the manga and its sequel, Kengan Omega, which contains another tournament I talked about on this list, Kengan vs. Purgatory. Please check them out and prepare to be blown away. The Kengan Annihilation Tournament is easily the best tournament I have ever seen in fiction, and the only tournament arc I have ever given a 10 out of 10 rating to. And if you haven't been convinced to read it by now, I've got some news for you. Kengan Ashura takes place in the same universe as How Heavy Are the Dumbbells You Lift. I'm serious, these aren't even non-canon crossovers. References to Kengan are everywhere in Dumbbells. Thank you all so much for watching.